Science versus spirituality. Is there actually any difference, or is it just two sides of the same coin? I believe it's the latter, because if you look at quantum physics and you study quantum physics, everything that the spiritual community talk about can all be explained through quantum physics. Quantum physics is the study of when you study an atom rather than a whole object. So whole objects like the chair I'm sitting on, that would be classical physics because it's a whole object. But when you break down the whole object like a chair to its most fundamental parts, which is an atom, and it goes, the smaller than that, the nucleus, the proton, the physics behind it changes completely. It's nothing like classical physics. There is no gravity. All the laws of classical physics completely change. And when we think about spirituality and all the radical, it's becoming less radical now because a lot more people are starting to believe in the spiritual ideas of like being psychic and, teleportation and transmutation and transcendence, being in the present moment, astral traveling, seeing entities, ghosts, the paranormal, all of these ideas that, let's say, scientific people probably wouldn't necessarily usually believe because it's too woo-woo. Well, actually now, through quantum physics is actually explaining these phenomenons in a scientific way. So, for example, in quantum physics, there's something called the tunnel effect. The tunnel effect basically explains how some particles will move through a barrier and some won't. So, for example, if your neighbour has got their music on full blast, you will be able to hear some of the noise, but you won't hear it all. Because if you heard it all, the music would be just as loud in your room or your house as it is in theirs. But it isn't, is it? Because the wall is there and the wall blocks some of the sound. But why doesn't it block it all? So why does it block some of the sound but not all? What's the differentiation with the particles that make it through and the particles that don't? Well, it comes down to a law of probability. So the tunnel effect, actually, if we apply that to our physical bodies, the only reason, for example, that you can't jump through a wall is because the probability of it happening is so low, but it doesn't mean it's impossible, which means it is possible. The probability is low, but it's not impossible to jump through a wall. And there's been cases where people have dematerialized, and Uri Geller is a great example that's just sprung to mind of this. Uri Geller, for anyone who's a 1980s child, may know who Uri Geller was. He's the spoon bending guy. He used to go on TV and just bend spoons with his mind. And anyway, he's just made so much money now through astral traveling and being able to look over the earth and basically identify where oil is. So he got paid absolutely millions of dollars from oil companies because they wanted to use him to tell them where the oil was, to save them spending loads of money on drilling it all. Drilling here, drilling there and finding nothing. So they just paid him a fortune. He did that and he's like, a millionaire now, or even more than a millionaire, multimillionaire. So anyway, he was super psychic, bending spoons, astral traveling, looking at below the earth to see things that nobody else could see because he was seeing through material form. He was seeing through things, objects that typically we wouldn't be able to see through. So it is possible to do it, and it all comes down to probability, which is explained in quantum physics. The probability of being able to jump through a wall is very low, but not impossible. And Uri Geller, that actually did happen to him once. He actually dematerialized in the middle of New York, where he was walking along the street. He'd just been to see his friend. So he's got every single witness can verify that this happened. He vanished, his body dematerialized. Dematerializing just means vanishing, basically. And then rematerialized, reappeared about 400-500 kilometers away instantly and ended up being flung through the window of one of his other friends' living room. And they verified this happened. They were like, Uri Geller, what are you doing flying through my window? And he rematerialized in that position. And scientifically, this phenomena can be proven through what's called the tunnel effect, where some particles make it through and some don't. But nobody seems to know, and even scientists have not figured this out yet. Nobody knows what is the reason. And this is the only explanation for this at the moment is the law of probability, which means there isn't really a reason why some particles can travel through other particles and some can't. There isn't really a reason, like the particles that travel through aren't any different from the particles that don't. It's just the only explanation at this point is the law of probability. There's just a certain probability that it can happen and a certain probability that, well, not that it can, there's a certain probability that it will and a certain probability that it won't happen. So it's very random in that sense of understanding it. But the probability that, at least it is actually saying, through saying that there's a probability it can and it can't, actually fundamentally what quantum physics is saying is that it is possible. There is a small probability that it can happen. And there's, like I've just explained, there's examples where it has happened, where Uri Geller, his physical body, the particles, because we're just a bunch of particles really, that's all the human body is, the particles travelled through the tunnel of space-time and made it through to a different area of space-time, through a portal maybe. Maybe he ended up falling into a portal, or who knows. So the tunnel effect is really interesting, I think, and it's really builds a good bridge between the spiritual experiences that people have. And I'm not saying everybody travels through space-time, but, even just being psychic, if you can't travel through space-time physically, most people will never do that in their lives. But what definitely is happening now on a large scale is people are becoming more psychic. So their thoughts are traveling more flowing into other people's energy fields more. Thoughts are becoming more fluid and more free moving. You can see people are becoming more intuitive. People are definitely becoming more spiritual. Our vibration is increasing, basically, to put it, in a simple way. Our vibrations are increasing, and that's making us more psychic. How is that explained in science? Well, it's all explained in science through the tunnel effect in terms of the materia, passing through other physical objects or through space-time and then through a window, rematerializing, or through physics, through the concept of energy. There's so much explanation about energy when you start looking into quantum physics. Essentially, everything is just energy. Our consciousness is energy. Our body is energy. And in terms of everybody becoming more psychic, that's just because the energy, the density of matter is becoming lighter, which means that the energy that connects us all is moving quicker, it's moving more quickly, it's flowing more quickly, which means that thoughts, which are comprised of the same fundamental particles as physical objects, if you break it down to that fundamental level, is flowing more freely, which basically is becoming more psychic. So anyway, there's so much I could go into with the links of quantum physics and being spiritual, but essentially it's just different language to explain the same phenomena. Spiritual people will say psychic, astral traveling, energy is definitely an overlap. Scientific community and spiritual people talk about energy, which is good because that's really the basis of everything. But it's just a different language for talking about the same principles. So this debate about science versus spirituality, well, it's the same thing.